Half a century after the Beatles broke up and decades after John Lennon's death, Paul McCartney is speaking more openly than ever about the complex bond he shared with his former songwriting partner. In a recent introspective conversation, the 82-year-old McCartney reflected on the extraordinary highs and frustrating lows of his partnership with Lennon, admitting that even now he still sometimes asks himself, "What would John say about this?" Drawing on new interviews and archival revelations, this feature traces the origins of the Lennon-McCartney friendship, the rifts that led to the Beatles' breakup, their tit-for-tat diss tracks in 1970 to 71, public remarks from both men over the years, and the emotional reflections McCartney has shared, culminating in an imagined interview in which he finally lays bare his feelings about John's legacy. The story begins in a Liverpool churchyard in the summer of 1957, when 15-year-old Paul McCartney first encountered 16-year-old John Lennon. Lennon was already performing with his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, and McCartney impressed him with his guitar skills, playing a jumping rendition of Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and singing in tune. Lennon invited McCartney to join the Quarrymen almost immediately. From that day on, the two teenagers were inseparable musically. They shared the same love of American rock and roll, the Everly Brothers and Chuck Berry, and started writing songs together. They penned their first collaboration, Too Bad About Sorrows, within a year. By the early 1960s, the duo's band, soon to be renamed the Beatles, went from local fame to global stardom. Under the joint credit Lennon-McCartney, they produced an astonishing output of hit songs, around 180 compositions in total, most of which became Beatles recordings. Unlike many songwriting teams, John and Paul wrote both words and music. They worked eyeball to eyeball in the early days, co-writing melodies and lyrics side by side on the floor of McCartney's living room or Lennon's Aunt Mimi's house. This lightning bolt partnership produced classics like I Want to Hold Your Hand, All My Loving, and A Hard Day's Night, setting the stage for the band's dominance of the 1960s. As McCartney noted recently, having two creative minds working in tandem was nothing short of miraculous. A simple truth born of a friendship that had grown since their teens. By the late 1960s, however, the cracks between John and Paul and the other Beatles were beginning to show. The band had stopped touring after 1966 and was experimenting in the studio, but personal and business tensions were mounting. When manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, the Beatles lost the central figure who had previously steered them through bouts of ego and financial strain. Without Epstein, Lennon, now dating Yoko Ono, Harrison and Starr wanted to bring in Alan Klein to run the band's Apple Corp. Paul, however, backed the Eastman family, his soon-to-be in-laws. Paul's insistence on the Eastmans further deepened the split. To make matters worse, Lennon had by now made Ono virtually a fifth Beatle. Yoko Ono was present at almost every late 1968 session, often sitting by the mixing desk while the others worked. Her avant-garde influence and constant presence became a focal point of others' frustrations. In truth, she was a lightning rod for deeper rifts, financial woes, creative differences, Lennon's heroin use. Lennon later admitted that by 1969 he had essentially chosen Yoko over the band. I had to either be married to them, the Beatles, or Yoko, and I chose Yoko. At the same time, John and Paul's musical tastes were diverging. Lennon was writing more introspective, experimental songs, while McCartney gravitated toward catchy pop and old-school melodies. Lennon complained when upbeat Paul tunes like Hello Goodbye were chosen as A-sides, while he felt songs like I Am the Walrus were relegated to B-sides. He famously derided Obala Di, Obala Da as granny music, while Paul was frustrated that his Beatles compositions didn't always please John's avant-garde sensibility. On September 20th, 1969, John Lennon secretly told the other Beatles, plus Klein, that he was leaving the group. Klein convinced him to keep it quiet until a major Apple Records publishing deal was signed, which was done the same day. The Beatles carried on briefly, recording Abbey Road and even playing their famous last live show on the Apple rooftop. But to the world, the split was still under wraps. It wasn't until April 1970 that Paul publicly announced the breakup during a promotional interview for his first solo album. By then, John was already working on solo material. He later maintained that Paul's announcement and legal move to dissolve the partnership had effectively ended the group. In that 1970 Rolling Stone interview, Lennon didn't mince words. He said the Beatles had ended largely because we got fed up being sidemen for Paul and fumed that the film editors had made him feel like the others were secondary. The people that cut it as Paul is God and we're just lying around there. I felt sick. Such blunt attacks made headlines and set the stage for a very public feud between the two songwriters. Almost immediately after going solo, both McCartney and Lennon turned the powerful platform of pop music into a battleground. In May 1971, Paul released Ram, his first album with Linda McCartney. One song in particular, Too Many People, contained what Paul now calls the 1970s equivalent of what might today be called a diss track. In it, he complains about too many people preaching practices, which McCartney later admitted was definitely aimed at John, telling everyone what they ought to do. He was fed up with John and Yoko's counterculture slogans. The line, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two," originally named Yoko before Paul wisely erased her name. "I was angry," McCartney recalls now, "and I decided to turn my missiles on him too. But I'm not really that kind of writer, so it was quite veiled." Listening closely, one can even hear Paul try to subtly sing "Piss Off Cake" on the line, "Too many reaching for a piece of cake." That anger, however, was buried under an upbeat acoustic tune. John Lennon answered in kind later in 1971. On his album Imagine, he recorded How Do You Sleep, a savage, beat-heavy attack recorded with George Harrison on slide guitar. Lennon opens with "So Sgt. Pepper Took You by Surprise," and then unloads lines like, "The only thing you done was yesterday," and "Since you're gone, you're just another day." He even snarls, "You probably pinched that bitch anyway," a crude reference to the long-running dispute about the melody to "Yesterday." Lennon wrote the song in the wake of Paul's legal move to dissolve the Beatles' partnership, and it was clearly meant to sting. Paul later said those barbs hurt him deeply. He laughed off Yoko's claim in the press that Paul did nothing. All he ever did was book the studio. He recalled thinking, No, when he heard that, and then heard Lennon's "How Do You Sleep?" and responded internally, "No, man." McCartney also described hearing from colleagues that Lennon was influenced by Klein to go after Paul lyrically. "You see the atmosphere of, let's get Paul, let's nail him in a song," Paul said. Those things were pretty hurtful. Looking back, he conceded that their rivalry was a bit weird and a bit nasty, and that his heart wasn't really in the full-on feud. After all, the two men had shared everything since their teens, and Paul always was a good friend to John, he later recalled. Even Paul's friends noticed how uncomfortable he was with these feuds. McCartney admitted that in the years after 1969, he tried to come to terms with Yoko's presence, and even helped John with some songs like The Ballad of John and Yoko. But after the breakup, John turned nasty, Paul said. It was as if they had both grown up in Liverpool fights. "It was always good to get in the first punch," Paul joked, even though he regretted how things ended up. Aside from the songs, John and Paul occasionally traded barbs, or praise, in interviews. In Lennon's famous 1970 Rolling Stone interview, he blamed Paul's push for certain projects and suggested the band resented Yoko's presence. Over the years, Lennon softened on McCartney. For his part, Paul generally kept things calmer. He was the one who broke the news of the split to the press, and he was careful in interviews. In 1971, he expressed sadness at the Beatles' end, but deflected blame. He said simply that John had gone upstairs and stopped answering the phone, so I knew it was over. He did not openly attack John in the press, as John had done, even if the songs hinted at frustration. After Lennon's murder in December 1980, McCartney's tributes showed a softer side. He canceled tour dates and addressed mourners, saying John had been taken away before they could reconcile. In 1982, Paul paid tribute with Here Today, a conversational ballad addressed to John's memory. McCartney explained that writing it was very emotional as he remembered their relationship and realized he'd lost his friend. In recent years, McCartney has reflected on John in interviews. In 2023, he told Vanity Fair that he still finds himself asking, "What would John say?" about a song or situation. After John's death, he lost a creative counterbalance. There were two minds at work, and that interplay was nothing short of miraculous, he said. He recalled that John once confided, "Paul, I worry about how people are going to remember me when I die." And it kind of shocked him. In 2021, unseen footage from the Let It Be sessions released in the Beatles. Now, more than 4 decades after Lennon's death, McCartney seems ready to set the record straight. In our imagined late 2024 interview, the normally composed musician grew unexpectedly candid. His voice softened as he reflected on their friendship, the joy of composing together, and the heartbreak of their final years. He confessed he had kept certain thoughts bottled up, but realized he could do so no more. "We were like brothers, John and I, ever since we were kids. I mean, there's no one else I could have done what we did with. 2 minds, 2 hearts, just singing away in a cold Liverpool flat. I can still remember us lying on the floor with our guitars in the dead of night, ideas pouring out. But of course, there were rough times too. Really rough. I'm not proud of everything that happened. I guess I've protected myself by holding it in all these years. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe with notifications on to never miss a video.